The District of Columbia occupies a unique and often frustrating place in the American political landscape. As the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is home to the federal government, world-renowned institutions, and nearly 700,000 residents. Despite having a population greater than some states, D.C. remains politically disenfranchised, with no voting representation in Congress and no full autonomy over its local affairs. For decades, activists and lawmakers have pushed for D.C. statehood, arguing that residents deserve the same rights and representation as other Americans. Opponents, however, claim that statehood would violate constitutional principles, disrupt the balance of power, and politicize the federal district. The battle over D.C. status is more than just a question of governance. It is a debate over democracy, racial justice, and the future of American federalism. This chapter explores the history of Washington, D.C., its political struggles, and the arguments for and against statehood. We examine the constitutional, economic, and political implications of granting D.C. full representation in the Union and assess whether the movement for statehood will ultimately succeed. The not-quite-a-state dilemma. The founding of Washington, D.C. The unique status of Washington, D.C. was intentional. When the U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1787, the Founding Fathers sought to create a neutral federal district that would not be subject to the influence of any single state. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution grants Congress exclusive jurisdiction over the capital, ensuring that no state government would have undue control over the seat of national power. In 1790, the Residence Act established Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital, carved out of land donated by Maryland and Virginia. Initially, residents had the right to vote in Maryland and Virginia elections, but that changed in 1801 when Congress passed the Organic Act, stripping D.C. residents of their voting rights and placing the district under direct congressional control. The struggle for representation. For most of its history, D.C. residents have lacked full political representation. Unlike citizens in the 50 states, Washingtonians cannot elect voting members to Congress. They have a delegate in the House of Representatives, but that delegate cannot vote on final legislation. In the Senate, they have no representation at all. The fight for D.C. voting rights gained momentum in the 20th century. 23rd Amendment, 1961 granted D.C. residents the right to vote in presidential elections, but did not provide congressional representation. Home Rule Act 1973 allowed Washington, D.C. to elect its own mayor and city council, but Congress retains the power to override local laws. Statehood bills. Various attempts to grant D.C. statehood have been introduced in Congress, but none have been successful due to political opposition. Statehood movements and resistance. The case for statehood. Proponents of D.C. statehood argue that denying full representation to hundreds of thousands of tax-paying citizens is undemocratic. They highlight several key reasons why statehood is necessary. Taxation without representation. D.C. residents pay federal taxes, including income taxes, yet they have no voting members in Congress. This situation echoes the very grievances that led to the American Revolution. Larger than some states. With a population greater than Wyoming and Vermont, D.C. has a legitimate claim to statehood based on its size and economic contributions. Racial justice issue. The demographics of D.C. play a role in the debate. Historically, the district has had a black majority population, and many advocates argue that denying statehood perpetuates systemic racial inequality. Local autonomy. Congress can override D.C. laws, including its budget and policies on issues like marijuana legalization and criminal justice reform. Statehood would allow residents to govern themselves without federal interference. Opposition to statehood. Despite growing support, D.C. statehood faces significant opposition, primarily from Republican lawmakers and constitutional originalists. The main arguments against statehood include constitutional concerns. Opponents argue that statehood would require a constitutional amendment, as Article 1, Section 8 designates D.C. as a federal district. Simply passing a law to grant statehood could be challenged in court. Federal neutrality. The founders intended for the capital to remain independent of any state to prevent conflicts of interest. Statehood would give one state disproportionate influence over federal affairs. Partisan motivations. D.C. is overwhelmingly Democratic, and granting its statehood would likely add 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic House member, shifting the balance of power in Congress. Alternative solutions. Some opponents propose alternatives, such as retroceding most of D.C. back to Maryland, allowing residents to vote in Maryland elections while maintaining a small federal district for government buildings. The economics of statehood. Can D.C. sustain itself? One argument against D.C. statehood is that the district relies heavily on federal funding. However, economic data suggests that D.C. could sustain itself as a state. Strong economy. D.C. has a high GDP per capita, a thriving professional sector, and significant tourism revenue. Budget surplus. The city consistently runs a budget surplus and generates more federal tax revenue per capita than any state. Infrastructure and services. As a state, D.C. would need to take on additional responsibilities currently managed by the federal government, but it has the financial capacity to do so. Historical and global comparisons. The retrocession of Arlington and Alexandria. D.C. was originally carved out of land from both Maryland and Virginia. In 1846, Virginia's portion, including Arlington and Alexandria, was returned to the state in a process known as retrocession. Some opponents of statehood argue that Maryland should similarly take back the remaining non-federal parts of D.C., allowing residents to gain congressional representation without creating a new state. However, retrocession is unpopular among D.C. residents, who see themselves as distinct from Maryland and prefer self-determination. International comparisons. Other nations have dealt with similar political dilemmas regarding their capital cities. Australia's Canberra. Like D.C., Canberra is a federal district, but residents have full voting rights in the national government. Belgium's Brussels. The city serves as both the national capital and the de facto capital of the European Union, maintaining special governance arrangements. Mexico's Mexico City. Formerly a federal district, Mexico City gained autonomy and greater representation through legal reforms in recent years. These examples show that granting full representation to capital city residents is possible without compromising national governance. The future of D.C. statehood. Recent developments. In 2020, the U.S. House of Representatives passed H.R. 51, a bill to make Washington, D.C. the 51st state. However, the bill stalled in the Senate due to Republican opposition. President Joe Biden has expressed support for statehood, but without a clear path through Congress, the issue remains unresolved. Potential pathways. Several possible outcomes exist for D.C.'s future. Statehood via legislation. If Democrats gain enough control of Congress, they could pass a statehood bill, though legal challenges would likely follow. Constitutional amendment. A more permanent but difficult solution would be to pass a constitutional amendment explicitly granting D.C. statehood. Limited representation. Congress could grant D.C. voting representation in the House without full statehood, though this would not address Senate representation. Retrocession to Maryland, a compromise solution though unlikely, would be to return most of D.C. to Maryland while keeping a small federal district for government buildings. Conclusion. D.C.'s quest for statehood is one of the most significant and unresolved civil rights issues in modern American politics. The district's residents, who contribute to the nation's economy and military service, remain denied full representation in the government they help sustain. While statehood has gained momentum, constitutional, political, and partisan challenges continue to block its path. As the fight for D.C. representation moves forward, the fundamental question remains: should a democratic nation deny full voting rights to the residents of its own capital? The answer will shape not only the future of Washington, D.C., but also the principles of American democracy itself.